Already.
Peter, Jerrold Kachur also taught at Istanbul University, Istanbul Boğaziçi University.
I know. That's why we have common students, because we were teaching together.
Yeah.
It took longer. Hey, is that Senese? I think I saw.
Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
Hi, everyone.
Good to see you.
Welcome.
So how are the riots going over there?
Oh, ongoing. Slowing.
Yeah.
Slowing though.
Oh yeah. The slave traders are tumbling, right?
Yeah, the slave trade is ongoing too.
All right.
How are you doing?
Well, okay. We were reeling from the news of Jerry Kachur.
Yeah.
We'll probably do a minute silence now for him. Last time I was there, it was with Jerry, in fact.
Yes.
Eda Ata, you know. I think I saw a Greek person, a Greek Cypriot. Okay.
So there are more people coming.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah.
I know this guy. Can they see us? Yes. Who is this? Oh, no, it's not. I thought it was somebody I knew. Okay.
Tamam, hadi bakayım. Ben de notluyorum. Sen de notluyorsun. Sesi.
So there are some more people coming. I'll start. I'll go on admitting more participants for a minute more, maybe, Fatma Hocam?
Yes, we can.
Interesting, eh? This Zoom and all this stuff. It makes us more international. Yeah.
Today we have participants literally around the world. It's great to see everyone.
That's one of the great things about this. And you can just planes, even when it settles, to do conferences. But I think nothing beats face-to-face teaching, huh?
It is screen to screen, Peter.
Huh?
Not face to face, but screen to screen.
Yeah, virtual reality. I have to get rid of this because otherwise I start touching it. Okay. I'm going to do like Dave Letterman used to do. Just throw it.
Arturo Ramirez says greetings from Ecuador.
Hola.
Hola.
Hi, everyone.
Nice to see you.
How are you, Arturo? Okay. Hola.
Very well, very well. How are you, Professor?
Not bad, no man.
Hi, Arturo.
Hey,
Glad
how
to
are
see you here.
Thank you so much for giving me that info. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, are they still coming, Eda? Should we start?
I think we can start.
Okay. More people are coming, all international people from all over the world. I'm very proud having you here, my friends, dear guests, dear educators, dear teachers, dear students, everybody from all over the world. This is another Global Thursday Talks. Welcome to our third meeting here. And I am very honored hosting Peter Mayo here. We are going to talk about him, of course, and this format will be interview format, not a talk, not a speech, but we're going to ask questions, to him, and this will be a more interactive session for us today. But before we start, we would like to devote a moment of silence for Jerrold Kachur, that we unfortunately lost him last week. And Jerrold Kachur was a professor of international political economy, social theory, and political philosophy. And he was the author of many books on education, social justice, and critical pedagogy. His famous book was Contested Classrooms, which he touched upon many problems, many critical issues about the classrooms in Canada, in Alberta. So we are very saddened to lose him, to hear the news that he passed away last week. And now, please, I'd like to devote this one moment for silence for him, for his memory. Okay, thank you so much for joining us for this memorable moment. And now, Eda, it is your floor, please.
Thank you, Hocam. I'm having a technical thing here. Just a second. Thank you, everyone. It is a great pleasure to see everyone here. Thank you all for showing up. Today, I would like to start by quickly talking about Fatma Hocam and Peter Mayo. And I will go over some details for a better seminar. So, as you know, Dr. Mızıkacı specialized in curriculum and instruction, and her interests are on privatization, and she's currently an associate professor at Ankara University. And recently, Fatma Mızıkacı has been hosting Global Thursday Talks, and this is the third talk today, and I hope we will all have a very fruitful interview with Mayo. And Professor Peter Mayo is regarded as a leading international figure in critical pedagogy, adult education, and on Paulo Freire and Antonio Gramsci. He has made distinctive contributions to sociology of education. He has produced 22 books published by leading publishers such as Routledge, Rowman and Littlefield, Z Books, Zero Books, Prager, Real and Sense, Bloomsbury Academic, and Peter Lang. 4 of his books were translated into Turkish, and his book on Gramsci and Freire, as it is a famous book among educators here. His book on Gramsci and Freire was published in 8 languages, with publishers including Argument in Germany and Arte Medicas in Brazil. Last year, Professor Mayo was inducted into the International Adult Continuing Education Hall of Fame. And again, I would like to thank everyone, our participants, and I would like to remind the overall flow. Here are some overall reminders. Please stay mute. And you can use the chat box to type your questions during the talk. You can just send them to me privately, or you can just send it to everyone. We will have a question and answer part at the end of the interview. So I wish everyone a nice and fruitful educational, in a way, solidarity. And I think we can start with our first question. The floor is yours.
Okay, Eda, thank you for this good introduction. Today we are going to interview with Peter Mayo. But our first question will be about, again, Jerrold Kachur. What are your memories with him, Peter?
Yeah,
Please
first of,
tell us about him a little bit,
yeah,
so
sure.
that we can spare some time for him.
Yeah, it's a lovely question because he deserves to be remembered. Merhaba, first of all. Well, I mean, I was shocked by the news on Tuesday morning that, or Monday, I think it was Monday, that Jerry had passed earlier in the morning, because we are 8 hours ahead of Edmonton, where Jerry lives. And of course, I was gobsmacked. I was shattered by the news. I never realized it was that serious about him in terms of his illness. As you know, Jerry left quite a legacy here in Turkey, both in Istanbul and...
Yes.
I first got to know Jerry in... I had studied in the same university where Jerry did his PhD, but much earlier than him. I was there from University of Alberta in Edmonton, the oil city, okay? And I was there I left in 1988. And then I had been in Toronto to do my doctorate, but I didn't go back to Ankara. When I had the time, I would go back to Malta because of my family, whatever. So, you know, it came as a great surprise to me that I got invited to a conference from Malta in Edmonton, because my supervisor also passed away, Cousin Bakus. They did a conference in his honor. And that's where I met Jerry for the first time. Jerry had just finished his doctorate. He had just finished his doctorate at the time, and he was striking. I was struck by his, you know, he was somebody special. I could realize this guy, you know, like, you know who you're talking to when you speak to him. It's an old expression I used to hear in Malta. He was very strong on policy sociology, very good social theorist, and a lovely man, very friendly. He was from Saskatchewan, did his doctorate there, and then of course we would meet at conferences, and we used to hang out a lot. I next met him in Mexico. And so did my friend Carmel Borge from Malta. He was with me. And then, of course, we met again in other conferences. I remember one in Toronto, mostly comparative international education. That's the area in which we used to meet, those kind of conferences, IES. So we used to meet always at this conference. And then in 2000 and... I believe it was 2007, 2008. I came to Istanbul, to Turkey for the first time, and I gave a lecture at Boğaziçi. My friend Fatma got. And they asked me to teach. And Jerry was teaching there for much longer than I was, so we reacquainted ourselves, and we were teaching together. We had the same group of students together, lovely students at Boğaziçi, very critical. You can see the sense of Istanbul, that the kind of, like Ankara, that kind of secular spirit, that sense of, I don't know, I was struck by the very, you know, you have a mixture between Kemalists and left-wing, really Marxist people over there, or postmodernists. And I was amazed because the students we had were also doing doctorates. One of them had worked with Spivak in Colombia. So it was a very enriching experience. It is interesting that we had the same students, and I taught only half the course. I thought it was going to be too long, so we split it, Carmel Borge and myself. So I caught the plane back after a week and a half. But Jerry remained here, Jerry Kachur. And of course, Carmel came the second week and a half. So I spent a lot of time with Jerry, much to his misfortune, probably, because I talk too much. And then Carmel spent the second week and a half with Jerry. So, you know, if I got to know Jerry very well, Carmel even so. I think they went to a football match together, whatever. That, the year before, I had been teaching in Edmonton again. And Jerry was there. And I have lovely memories of him. You know, like two people really took care of me there, and both of them died young. One was Donna Chovanec. She came to the airport to pick me up. Jerry took me, there was a World Cup under 20 tournaments being staged in Canada. And Jerry took me with his son. His son is quite big now, I mean, in terms of years. They took me to the stadium to watch a treat, to watch, I believe it was Czech Republic and Spain. And there were some famous footballers playing there, although they were under 21, under 20. So that was a lovely memory. I read some of his stuff, that book you just mentioned, Contested Terrain. I remember that book. I think it was an edited book. And there were some really mutual friends over there, one of whom also passed away. So I've lost four good friends now from Edmonton. I lost him, he's the latest. I lost Gordon Hay, I lost Susan Belcher, and Donna Chovanec. They were very good sociologists in terms of their background, etc. So it's no fun to go back to Edmonton now, knowing that some of the people who were students together, or people I met afterwards, you know, people like Jerry and others, like Donna, etc. And to know that they're no longer there, it would be very, very sad to go back to Edmonton. So I associate Jerry with two places, Edmonton and either Ankara, three places, Ankara and Istanbul, because, you know, there's an association. He loved Turkey very much. At one stage, he was thinking seriously of leaving Alberta and coming here to Turkey to take up a position here. So he loved Turkey very much, to the point that he even had the temerity to present, we were at the CIS conference. And I said, how do you do that, Jerry? You know, you don't teach China to the Chinese. He presented about Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal. And I would find that scary, but he was extremely knowledgeable. He knew a lot about Turkey. He had read so many books before he came here. So that was amazing about him. And I know some of my people used to teach me, spoke very highly about Jerry from the word go. Raymond Morrow, Derek Sayer. So I communicated the bad news to them. Raymond Morrow already knew when he passed away before I wrote to him. And Derek Sayer was appreciative of the fact that I contacted him to tell him that Jerry passed away. He's highly regarded. I think I've lost a good friend, and I think sociology of education, policy studies, and social theory have lost a brilliant scholar.
Okay, thank you. I'm very sorry. I'm sad about your loss, about our loss, and it's a good opportunity, you know, to share your memories here. I didn't know that you have so many common memories with him. I knew, of course, he was here 2 times in Turkey, once in Istanbul, once in Ankara, but yeah, it's a great loss of us. Maybe we can think of, you know, translating his book, this Contested Classrooms book into Turkish. Who knows? It's a good opportunity to talk about this. Thank you, Peter. Okay, let's continue with our questions in this interview session.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Thank you for that question to give me the chance to pay my tributes to a good friend.
Okay, you're welcome, of course. Now we start our interview with a basic question, and we want to know you better, maybe deeper, your thought, your opinions, your approach to the critical pedagogy, for example. Our first question is very basic. Peter, how would you define critical pedagogy?
Critical pedagogy, critical education, critical studies in education. What's in the name? Romeo once asked, right? And Romeo and Juliet. But the common element is that it's very different. When I used to teach in schools, before I moved into grad studies and got introduced to critical sociology of education and studied sociology seriously, because I used to take courses like Jerry, same professors in the sociology department, I had a very, very liberal view of education. Typical that you have the knowledge, you are preparing, you're going there. If only they listen to me, you know, it's for their own good. It was very, very much like old-fashioned kind of thinking. You know, I shall bring you freedom. Well, critical pedagogy is not about that. It's about connecting education. So you would think you're doing something neutral. I should have read Paulo Freire before I went into teaching. I did not. It was mentioned in our class. Some people did read him. I read Rousseau. We had a choice, you know. So I read Rousseau, Emile. And friends of mine read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I said, when I finish my studies in English literature, that's the first book I'm going to read. Well, I went to Edmonton to study sociology of education. And the first semester, I got this opportunity. Now, when you read Paulo Freire, you read people in sociology of education at the time, Jean Anion, God rest her soul, she passed away too. She's probably, her spirit is never going to forgive me for a review I wrote of one of her books on Marx. And then I was taking courses in social theory in the sociology department, reading Marx, we're reading Max Weber. We didn't do Durkheim, I did it later as a follow-up. And you put these two together, your conception of education changes. And that was my introduction, I would say, to critical education. Reading Marx in the original, albeit translated into English, selectively, of course. I doubt if there are how many people there are who have read Marx in total, even those who say they did. And of course, I was also reading Paulo Freire, I was reading Julius Nyerere, so many. Obviously, I had left-wing leanings in me, and I needed something like Lady Macbeth to trigger them off, you know? And that happened. And from then on, this was my whole perception, my whole paradigm of teaching and education completely changed. And there was no going back after that. This is the only way I can look at education. There's no way, for example, I was once encouraged to do a doctorate in human resource development. I wonder what I would have done had this offer come along before. There was no way I'm going to take that road because now I'm settled. You know, this is the path I'm going to take. And that's what introduced me to critical pedagogy. What do I look at? What do I find in critical education or critical pedagogy? Well, it varies, right? The issue of power is multifaceted. We used to do a lot of stuff on social class when I was in Alberta. But of course, it's not just social class. It hasn't gone away. Nothing changes that, but it intersects with so many other things. And maybe the difference between Alberta and Toronto, where I did my doctorate, that was a more of an urban area. There was more on feminism over there, and there was how do you find intersections? So I would say the nexus between education and power. How do you look at power? Mm-hmm. I then studied somebody very important, apart from Freire. It was something I always wanted to do because I came from very close to Italy. And in the 70s, you hear this name over and over again. That's Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci of the 70s in Italy was a turbulent period. This was a time of urban guerrillas in Italy, the Red Brigade, Brigate Rosse, etc. Great turbulence. And I was studying literature. And I said, I was doing this class with a common teacher, a mutual teacher for Jerry and myself, Raymond Morrow. and I was doing Freire, we were doing Marx, and he had in his course description Antonio Gramsci. Of course, nobody touched Gramsci except one person, Gordon Hay, who I'd mentioned. I said, no, this is, I want to know this Gramsci. We've heard so much about Gramsci. So I started reading Gramsci, and my paper for that term was Gramsci and Freire. That's where it all started. And so you read Gramsci, you read Freire, and then I remember Raymond Morrow told me, if you're going to take up this issue, which goes beyond the requirements of the course, you should know what's being written about critical education today. And he gave me a book by a certain Henry Giroux, who now is was a very good friend of mine, but he was just a name. I thought he was French with that surname, you know, and Theory and Resistance. And I have to say, that writing by Henry at the time was very different from the Henry has been writing for the last 20 years, honestly. His style changed completely. It was that was a tour de force, Theory and Resistance. It's a book, I'm sure it's been translated to Turkish. You know this book, Theory and Resistance. But then Henry, you know, it's very difficult to keep up with Henry because he produces, I don't know how many books a year. And of course, his writing became very, very accessible. He writes like a journalist, I would say, in a way, very different from his first book. So with that kind of thing, that is the intellectual milieu I was exposed to. However, what's even more important is the friends you meet. Okay, it's not just reading stuff, but discussing them with friends. Now, this was a very interesting place. I went to Alberta in Edmonton. You get out of Edmonton and you mention that you're in Alberta with amongst the leftist person. What? You are in Edmonton? They'll say, I mean, I wouldn't touch that place with a barge pole because it has a tradition, it has a reputation of being very conservative. They've always had a conservative government in power. But the university is different. And the problem here is that if you live, I had a family with me, etc., but we were always family residents. Okay, we go to the malls and things like that. Man's commitment or people's commitment to capitalism. They had the biggest shopping mall in the world at the time, West Edmonton Mall, overtaken now by Minnesota. And you stay inside the campus, you get a different perception of what Edmonton is, as opposed to going out there. So while it was very conservative, we were in a sort of cocoon and in a left-wing cocoon. But of course, I was being fooled by the kind of courses I was taking and the kind of professors I was mixing with, which were not all the professors. So I took courses in sociology, but they had a program which I never touched, which was about corrections, which was mainly prisons primarily, you know, this kind of euphemism, correctional facility, corrections. And so it was a conservative department, but I was mixing with the people who were, you know, we had a great expert on Marx. You couldn't learn Marx better than this person. I did a paper on Gramsci for him. That was Derek Sayer. Raymond Morrow, very much into critical theory, personally, himself, I mean, and sociology of knowledge. So all that mix, plus the friends, the students. There are some students, you know, one of the people who passed away, I mentioned Gordon. They were inspirational. They were the kind of person now where we can discuss issues. We had our own space and office space. We would discuss issues, and then of course you're following what's happening in the world. It was an interesting time. We still had the Cold War towards the end of it. I'm talking about 86, 88. We had Gorbachev coming in to Russia, to the Soviet Union, but we had Ronald Reagan, you know? So all this Reaganomics going on, which we later called neoliberalism, but I had seen that also in England with Margaret Thatcher. Later, I got to know that it all started in bloodshed in Chile. So all these things were going on. There was the Iran-Contra Gate, I remember, one of the big issues. And then there was that one place, which was the, how shall I put it? This is the late 86, 88. There was this place which captured North Americans, left-wing people, lefties, imagination, which was, Guy, you probably know that, Nicaragua. So everybody was into Nicaragua at that time. The Sandinistas were in power. The reforms that they were bringing about, you know, and of course Reagan would see red when you just mentioned the mere mention of Nicaragua. So we were doing theoretical stuff, but we were also having stories from people who had been down to Nicaragua, reading books about Nicaragua, you know, and then of course, you are mixing with international students who come with their own issues. So my next door neighbor was from Guatemala, and he's telling me all about the atrocities happening in Guatemala. So he gives me this terrible book called Guatemala in Rebellion. Oh my God, this is the kind of life. It's like El Salvador. Then he told me, come, I'll show you my reality. And he shows me the Salvador, Oliver Stone. I believe it was Oliver Stone, I'm not sure. Okay, there was James Fox and Belushi was in that film. And, you know, all these things coming together. Latin America was an important place there. And then of course, Africa too, mostly Tanzania. Julius Nyerere was still president at the time. He had just resigned from president of the country, but was president of the party, the policy-making body. So yeah, all these are factors which brought me into, call it critical pedagogy, the politics of education, politics primarily, and yeah. And I think moving from English literature to sociology of education was a very interesting thing. But there was a common element between the two.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Peter, as I see, sorry. As I see, there are some factors that you were drawn to this path. It is context that you were in, and your contacts, people around, and social events, maybe social changes at that time, and also the time that the world is changing, you know.
And my first time living outside of my own country, which was very different from the way it is today. Most of the things I found in Edmonton, which is it's not Toronto, it's not New York City, you know, but for me it was a lot. The international mix, you know, the racial mix. Now we have it in Malta. Now, you know, it came here, but it wasn't like that at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's for the first time meeting people who are Black. That was for them, and you know, I still remember there were kids, you know, like sort of the first time they were having it, you know, and then they would end up playing with Black students, kids, you know, and with Indigenous. This is something new for me, the Indigenous factor. You know, I thought Indigenous would be, I was going to take a course in that. Indigenous is how to learn something indigenous to your country and, you know, and use it in education. No, it's about indigeneity. You know, you're learning about tribes. Alberta is well known for that because you have different, you've got a lot of areas. And then meeting a student who was the deputy editor, his name was Terry Lusty, of the native newspaper called The Windspeaker. And he used to give me a copy every week. So I begin to say, when my wife wants to go and buy the Hudson Bay Company, the Bay, they call it in Canada, okay, then you read the history of it. I told her, Josie, don't go there. You know, these guys destroyed the native community, the indigenous community. You know, they were part of the fur trade, etc. You begin to see the politics of these big companies. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Actually, my next question was about what drew you close to this type of educational inquiry? But if you feel you have already answered this, we can skip
I would like to add something. I was going to say something. I moved from English literature to doing sociology because they were developing a faculty of education, and I loved sociology, but I didn't know much about it. We had sociology. Mm-hmm. You know, I really started studying sociology in Alberta. And what happened was that there was a common element, and there was one writer who was coming to the two areas. and this was Raymond Williams. I had a special paper, my BA English, in modern drama in the United States, in America, and in Europe. And my vademecum, the book he would always keep referring to, subsequently, when I read his biography, I realized this was an extension of his long essay at Cambridge, which was about Ibsen. And it was called Drama from Ibsen to Brecht. So I'm associating this person with literary theory. I go to Edmonton, and it was another interesting course, which I took there. And it was about education and development, taught by my supervisor, Cousin Bacchus, and he gives us readings. And one of the readings we had was Raymond Williams, a famous chapter today, published in different places. It was written in the New Left Review, then in his anthology, Marxism and Literature, which is called Base and Superstructure, you know, the more Marxist thing, Base and Superstructure in Marxist Cultural Theory. And I said, I had a Raymond Williams in my English studies. Is this the same one? And somebody was saying by mistake, because the film Good Morning Vietnam came out at the time, and saying Robin Williams. I said, oh, Robin, not it's got Raymond written here. And then I discovered it's the same person, you know? So he was like the, how should I put it? I probably never said this before, but he was the link between my old studies and my new ones. So, you know, but to critical pedagogy, it changed my whole view of life, that my notion about thinking from then onwards changed completely. I mean, changed completely. I had a very traditional, conventional approach. I was a teacher of English, so I would try to emulate the Brits. We called aping the Brits. Mm-hmm. One thing which both my studies and the Canadians themselves did was speak in your own way, you know, speak with a Maltese accent. Don't try to emulate what cannot be emulated and what will turn you into an artificial person. So yeah, I knocked off all that bullshit, if you like, of language, you know, trying to be like the Brits, because you're never going to be like them. And why should you? This is your own personality. So that transition, I must have been a real pain asshole, as we say over there at the beginning. They would tell me, the Maltese Falcon, they would tell me the first thing. And I would just turn around, you know, with all this colonial thing about me. You mean Falcon? That's bad. But I did, you know, that changed. That completely went out of the window eventually. So also at the personal level, you stop being, you know, like deserving having your teeth pushed in or your lights out. And yeah, you become much more critical about things, which I never was about. I was never like that before. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this answer. And I feel everybody here now at the moment have some similar things, you know, in their life. That's why we are here together. Mm-hmm. That's why we, at this hour, you know, it's evening here and morning over there, and we get together. And this is the common thing we have experienced in our lives somewhere, sometime. For myself, I can say this is very similar, you know, you feel something and you are attracted by critical pedagogy because there's something to discover deeper into it. And it is human and you feel close to it. Okay, thank you so much. And my next question is very critical because we here at the academy in education, we discuss this conceptual thing. You know, there are two concepts, critical pedagogy and critical education. Is there a difference between them? What do you think?
No, I don't think we should be. I don't think we should be bothered about these differences. These are, I'm going to be honest about this. Some people say critical pedagogy, some people say critical education. I try to, you know, I've got friends on you know, in both camps. Once something becomes an area in academia, it becomes funny because you have a clash between one and the other. So they've got this camp and the others have this camp, and they're saying the same stuff. The Freire camp, for example, is split. It's split. There are people who take the side of Nita Freire, which is the second wife of Paulo. Others are with another group who support, probably connected with the first wife of Paulo, who died in 1987 when I was in 86, when I was there. And you know, you got friends on both sides, and I find this really a waste of time, a waste of energy. There's so much things to do. And I remember Guy Senese gave a talk in here in Ankara. And instead of these people, I'm going to come to this. He gave us a talk about the charter schools. And am I seeing Guy? Where is he? And I remember one of them had the temerity to call, you know, these charter schools, they're making money out of people, etc. Anything but Freirean. But some of them have the temerity to call themselves a Paulo Freire charter school, and then they will say, sorry, you applied too late or something like this. Now, instead of this kind of infighting, shouldn't the Freireans come together, organized internationally, strongly, to disrupt this moment within capitalism, where the figure of Paulo Freire becomes exploited by capitalism itself, in the same way that Che Guevara's figure has been exploited. You know, like how today's revolutionary martyr becomes tomorrow's commercial icon, as Roger Simon once put it. You know, there's so much things to do today, you know, that it should bring, you know, like, so whether it's critical pedagogy or critical education, I think it's the same. It's probably a matter of personnel. I don't want to work in that camp. I wrote a paper right now, recently, about Gramsci's influence on critical pedagogy in the United States. And Guy, I did mention your paper in it. And of course, I didn't want to get in either of them. I said, listen, the same thing. So I said, critical studies in education. So that I can talk about Peter Mclaren, I can talk about Henry Jerrold, I can talk about Michael Apple, I can talk about Sheila Mclaren, etc. You know. So, and I also mentioned Turkey. No, but this was about America, but in other papers I have, because you've done a lot in Turkey on critical pedagogy, and you for it a lot in critical pedagogy. But that's for another question, because this paper was about the influence of Gramsci in North American critical studies in education.
Yes, I was going to ask that question. Thank you for this clarification between these terms, so we don't need to think too much.
I wouldn't waste energy on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
you for
academics always, you know, being in groups.
Well, okay. My next question, again, you mentioned about Gramsci and Freire, but why are these people important for critical pedagogy? You wrote a considerable amount of writings, books, and papers. You published them, and why are they important, Peter?
Well, let me put it this way. I was giving a similar interview in Malta, of course, like this one, last month, Monday. And I was asked the same question. There are similarities, there are convergences between the two, but it doesn't mean it has to be always Gramsci or Paulo Freire. No, I mean, there are so many, I don't want to deviate. Hopefully I might get a question on our part of the world, the south of Europe or the Mediterranean or the East in your case, because we have our own Gramsci's, and Gramsci's from that part of the world, of course, but we have our own Freires in this part of the world, or they have our Milanis in this part of, in their part of the world. So I've also written a paper on, for example, Paulo Freire and Don Milani. Now, you can compare people. There are quite a number of people one can compare and one can synthesize from. So when I'm talking about Freire and Gramsci, probably in my synthesis, there are other authors who come in. I mentioned Raymond Williams is one of them. I mentioned Julius Nyerere, he comes in. I mentioned, not much about Turkey. I should. I do mention, however, contemporary action in Turkey, because I really admire the kind of work on the ground and how the universities, especially your University of Ankara and Boğaziçi too, public universities, interact with students out in the square, never minding the tear gas or the plastic things shot at you. So that's amazing. Turkey reserves a lot of plaudits in terms of eleştiri pedagogy, critical pedagogy. You even have a journal in Turkish, now you have another one, Rethinking Critical Pedagogy. And the people have suffered. People just don't write here, but they suffer. You had an editor of a left-wing newspaper called Sol, who was killed by the military regime, which took over. It was like Chile on the 12th of September. Chile was 11th September, so more or less, we're talking about the same date. Why? For the same purpose, to speed up neoliberalism. It was in Turkey. That guy from he was your prime minister, who was an expert for the World Bank, and then he drowned mysteriously. He was involved. He was a World Bank consultant. He was to speed up, and there was this coup d'etat. Right? Am I correct? Or I don't want to teach Turkey to the Turks, of course. One of the things that Don Milani says, never teach China to the Chinese. So there could be different people I could bring in. Somebody else would bring in the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer. So they all become part of this package. So it so happened I was fascinated by these two people, but I saw a big similarity. I would argue that Gramsci provides the wider political theory. I mean, Gramsci's notion of power, I found quite, I don't want to use the word interesting because that means non-interesting. I found it quite captivating how power is conceived in Gramsci. And without trying to minimize this, I see similarities, and I see a possibility of a book here for somebody to do it, between Gramsci's notion of power and Foucault. But Gramsci had a very clear emancipatory project. Foucault's emancipation is very different. Bodies and pleasure, self-creation. But there's a very long similarity. You are never outside the very same thing you are critiquing. You can have power, and there is no power without resistance, but that resistance is never external to the power structure itself. That could be Gramsci signing that. That's the whole notion of hegemony. You're never outside it. And therefore what you do is you use the strength of your lobby within the interstices of hegemony itself to renegotiate relations of hegemony, because after all, it's all relations. The state is a set of relations, it's an ensemble of relations. These are relations. You challenge given relations, the legitimacy of certain relations. You're changing the state. You are challenging hegemony. Now, when small things like LGBTQ rights come in, they are challenging established roots. Hegemony is changing, but not at the core, because there's always the danger that you can use that as pink washing. Meanwhile, the economy remains the same, so it has to be on different fronts, but it's always changing. And I find this quite amazing. And I saw similarities between Paulo Freire and Gramsci, even though Paulo Freire, in his most famous book, which you have translated in Turkish, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, because it still remains the book to read, is primarily, he never mentions Gramsci. Nowhere, Raymond Morrow pointed this out to me recently, nowhere in the book is there any reference to Gramsci in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now that was written in 1968, Pedagogia do Oprimido, precisely as according to Paulo Freire himself. That was the year he read Gramsci for the first time. He read it in Chile when he was in exile, of course, when Marcela Gajardo gave him a copy of an anthology, which I have in Italian. It's called Letteratura e vita nazionale, literature and national life. It must have been translated into Spanish before it. It has been translated to Spanish when you have many of the pieces which you find in the English version of the cultural writings. A very fascinating book, a very important book. I've been doing some work on it recently. And that's where it got started. So for me, it was important to have Gramsci and Freire, but there is something, I don't know what it is, that the two tend to be, and it's not because of me, they tend to be mentioned in the same breath. So this thing he was figuring out, it was being figured out even before. But I also wrote about Paulo Freire and Domilani. Big similarities, and important differences. That's how you create a synthesis. Convergences and divergences, you know, they become complementary. But yes, I do find the basic concept between the two is, for me, praxis. The Greek word praxis, which is not, the Italians use the word prassi, which has nothing to do with praxis, because it means abitudine, what you habitually do. Many people get this wrong. You see papers everywhere in academia. I'm amazed by established professors. They throw terms around without, I hate to say it, I find it ridiculous. Theory and praxis. How many times have I seen this? In books, published books. They say nobody vets these books. Theory is embedded in praxis because theory is a codification of reflection. So to separate the two is problematic. Or praxis and consciousness, big deal. Praxis includes consciousness. It's not something separate. And to see this even written by established Marxists makes me, I find it, but maybe I probably do the same thing with other things, with other concepts. So I find this, one has to very be careful how terms get used and thrown around. Anyway, praxis for me is the most important thing. Then I once wrote for a Dicionario Paulo Freire in Brazil. And I was asked to tackle the concept of intellectuals in Freire. And of course, my point of departure was Gramsci on the intellectuals, the subaltern and the dominant intellectuals, then the organic and the traditional, very complex way of looking at them, you know, etc. And Freire, in his later work, made references to the organic intellectual, especially when he wrote about Guinea-Bissau. He went to this place called Guinea-Bissau, and the context conditions informs your view of things. And that's where Freire was at his most Marxist. And I would say, what kind of Marxist? Not the early Marx, like you have in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, not the Paris manuscripts, the the Holy Family, all this kind of work, and the Die Deutsche Ideologie, the German ideology, which Gramsci probably would not have read because it was published very late in his life, but those ideas would have been percolated through the Communist Party, what they call them, the meetings, etc., the internationals, etc. So, you know, I'm not surprised that you find a lot of the ideas for hegemony in the German ideology. There he goes into Capital Volume 1. And he uses the idea of the new kind of intellectual in the Pedagogy. So then in his later work, Gramsci becomes much more stronger and explicitly so. Paulo Freire is explicit about that. So praxis in particular, for me, is the big one. And then, of course, the relationship between movements and party. Party in Gramsci's time, but Gramsci, one has to be very careful. Gramsci was writing in Italy, a very different Italy from today. He didn't deal with the multicultural aspect and sense of international people, migrants. He was talking about migrants from the south and the north, with a lot of things for us to learn about present day reality. But there were, you know, people from Calabria, people from Sicily, people even from Sardinia, which geographically is on the same line with Rome. And he himself was like that. But party was a real thing, because party in Italy was a very important concept. Can I imagine that when you discuss Gramsci in the United States today? No, I don't. I think the trick is, and I have problems with my friends about this. I have problems with, for example, I don't think he'll mind my saying this. This is debate after all. John Holst, who keeps harping on party. Yes, in Italy at the time. Not even today, I would say, because today people are cool off after Tangentopoli parties. I think the most important point is to have nodal points, something I took up from Stuart Hall. Nodal points. Now, where is the nodal point of many of the big struggles in the United States from the 60s onwards, the late 50s, 60s onwards? It's in the civil rights movement. So in the United States, a particular moment in time was the civil rights movement. And aren't you hearing the same thing today with the Black Lives Matter kind of movement? So it varies. It varies according to context. What captures people's imagination? I think party is a very European thing. It does happen. It does exist in Italy, in the United States, and people have called for a third party. I remember Henry Jerrold writing about this. But there, I think the social movement element is much stronger, and basically around race, and then how you have intersections with other aspects, including class. That's my view.
Okay. My next question will be about that Black Lives Matter, the international movements which started with the murder of George Floyd, and then it spread out, and there are still protests. And I talked to a guy yesterday, and he said they are still there, the protests, and so many different things are happening. How do you think we should relate this Black Lives Matter issue with critical pedagogy? How should we read this?
Well, I should think, and especially when you think, despite the influence of Paulo Freire and the internationalization of critical pedagogy, Antonia Darder, Puerto Rican, who lives in Los Angeles, João Parasqueva, who is from Mozambique, and myself edited a book, thanks to Antonia, she brought us into this, a book on the internationalization of critical pedagogy, and we give a lot of importance to Turkey in this book.
Yes.
Yeah, and of course, it's despite, however, the term critical pedagogy was probably coined in the United States, and most of the people who used to gravitate around this movement, your Henry Giroux, your Deborah Britzman, you know, your Peter Mclaren, etc. Once even Michael Apple was, and now he's more into critical education. It's the same thing for me. All these people, they came from the United States. And so you would expect, of course, something like the Black Lives Movement to impact on critical pedagogy because of the United States thing and Canadian thing too. And of course, I know Henry Giroux has been writing a lot about this. Most people have been writing about this in the United States. Of course, many of the signs we get in the United States, not to that extent, you find it everywhere. I can only talk about my country, Malta, right? We're made up of human beings like other people. We've got migration, big issue, okay? We don't have the history of slavery, of blacks, like the United States. Remember, this is a state, with all due respect to our American friends here, this is a state which was built on slavery. This is a state, I mean, the white state. I'm not talking about the indigenous state. Indigenous people were there before, but look how it, yeah, how was this built? You know, you have the suppression, the destruction in all the Americas, not just North America, not the United States, all the Americas of the indigenous population, which we now celebrate in our places, your Topkapi or our churches in Malta, that gold and silver. We never ask ourselves a very important question: how many indigenous people were massacred or mined because they were thrown into the pits with mercury, which makes them mined for life, so that they can produce the basic raw material for the creation of works of art, which we call things of beauty. But there is a tragedy beneath. And then you've got slavery in the United States, of course. We have slavery everywhere. But there you have a particular kind of slavery, which you have also in Europe, which is connected completely with capitalism. We're talking about the origins of capitalism here in its proto-capitalistic phase, you know, different stages. So it's a big moment. It's a big moment. I think it's crucial it's definitely crucial for critical pedagogy. now we have this moment where we have people now everywhere protesting. In Malta, we have protests. We have the Black Lives Movement there. I've written an article in the newspaper, and you see all the racists writing comments towards the end to, you know, comments, like calling me all kinds of things because I've written about Black Lives Matter. And I never said all lives matter, because it's not the same. There is something to be redressed before we start talking about equal things. You know, there's a whole history to be redressed. And in Malta, for example, a year ago, right? So it could have been the United States. People have been killed in the United States for many years. But you have one incident which triggers it off, right? Well, Malta, we've had, because of migration, we've had Black people or Arabs beaten to death by bouncers at nightclubs because they would not let them in, etc., etc. Same. Not on that same scale in terms of numbers, but it only takes one person for me. It's a human being. Now, a year ago, would you believe it? Talking about the police force, like they do in the United States, a force which often recruits from the working class, unfortunately. In Malta, I was in Canada at the AERA. While I was there, two members of the armed forces, apparently, because we can only use the word alleged until it goes through the court process, etc., decided to go out on a safari. The safari consisted of tracing any moving creature which they consider inferior and shoot it. Of course, they went out, apparently, from what we've heard, to search for stray cats and stray dogs, which is, for me, terrible enough. Anybody who does that, I wouldn't want to touch her or him with a barge pole. I mean, I happen to come from a family which loves cats. We've got cats here. So, you know, this is, for me, is already horrendous, but they didn't find cats and stray cats and dogs. So what do they do in the break? They target migrants, Black migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, from Côte d'Ivoire. So they fired shots, you know? I mean, this is cold-blooded murder. And these people, I'm ashamed to say I'm Maltese when I see these things, and two of them get injured, and one of them is killed. Happens to be from the Ivory Coast. It reminds me, I don't know if I'm going to sound a bit, the famous line from Shakespeare, King Lear, like flies to wanton gods. No, like flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport, although there was nothing godly about this. So and of course you can imagine, just before, like Black Lives, we had people protesting outside, etc. I wrote on my Facebook, you know, you vent your anger sometime there, etc. And of course, it's sub judice. Now we have to say, oh, sorry, you know, like it's only alleged. We have to prove it first. We'll see what's going to happen. And that was the connection for us in Malta about the Black Lives Matter. We had a movement in Valletta. I didn't go there, unfortunately, but they organized this thing. So that, you know, you're talking about Floyd, but at the same time, they're talking about Lassana Cissé. That's his name, the person who was killed. I remember once even going out of solidarity to a march in Valletta because somebody was beaten up by bouncers. He was from Sudan, I think. And then I went to the burial at the Muslim center behind me. So the first time I attended a Muslim burial, you know, I come from a Christian tradition in Malta. So yeah, I mean, this is an important moment. I personally, this is me, 65 years of age, thank God. Sorry, darn. I've seen so many false dawns in my life that I'm not gonna jump, oh, this is the moment. I have had, you know, I've seen so many false dawns, so I'm not gonna rush, I'm not gonna, but I think it's a moment which is worth pursuing because then it brings a lot of elements together. And the connection, people are now beginning to see, hopefully, the connection that people like Dave Hill has been writing about for years, the connection between and capitalism.
Dear Prof, speaking of Malta and racism, I would like to ask, how significant is anti-racist education in critical pedagogy in your country?
Oh, I wish it was better, but you never arrive in these things, right? Well, I happen to belong to a faculty which gives importance, yes, I must say, to anti-racist education. Whether we're getting across to our students, I'm not sure. I started teaching a course which was designed originally by a colleague of mine, Mary Darmanin, if she's following, I just would like to say hi. In 1996, I took a position there full time in 1993 in Malta, at the university. And we started teaching issues about race in this course. Now I had just come back from Toronto, all pumped up with anti-racist education and this kind of stuff. And I thought the most dangerous thing to teach in Malta, I used to dread it, believe me, was sexuality, sexual orientation. No, it wasn't. Actually, it was the most pleasant. That's where students will come out. I've had students come out in class for the first time. I'm not joking. You know, my fears were allayed, but when it came to racism, the reaction was not always. It would have a great debate, almost coming to fisticuffs as I'm not careful, you know. But you know, we had a lot of resistance from certain students. They will always throw in the gender issue. Look how they treat women. At first, before 2002, the attack was mostly on Muslims, Islamophobia. That was the big attack. And after that, with the mass waves of migration from sub-Saharan Africa in 2002 onwards, we begin to realize it's not just Islam, which is the old Mediterranean crusader tradition, which unfortunately, I hate to say it, Turks were the prototype, then they became Arab after that. You know, we were under the Knights of St. John, so many of our churches are very Islamophobic in that respect. So how to use those as a teaching space to question Islamophobia. Having said that, in 2002, it was no longer the Saracen who is the enemy, but anybody who doesn't look like the white personality. So you begin to question everything. You begin to question the use of color, and it brings up issues about our arts, the art we celebrate. You begin to question everything, even the language of poets. You know, black is always bad, black is, you know, the dark side, etc. And they accuse you, because there are no blacks amongst the students, as being silly. You are being silly. This is stupid. This is this. This is this. It's like when I talk about the golden silver. You know, okay, I mean, Jesus, it's okay. The rectangular is still a great work of art. I'm not denying the expression, but where did the material come from? So we faced that. So, you know, we had people in our faculty, because they were trained in North America, I would say, or New Zealand. So they were exposed to these issues, and England too, especially in sociology. We did take up these issues. Now we're doing a lot. We have a dean who comes from a department where they do a lot on the ground. Our major accusation was with all theory, but how do you translate this into practice? Okay, we're doing this now. And no, there is a mass in our community, not just our faculty. I know there are people in youth studies who are tackling these issues in sociology ever since the sociology department changed for the better, in my view, according to my values. So we have this movement, but we also have a lot of right-wing people. We have a far right, which is always gaining ground in the European elections. And these are Nazis, these are outright, there's no other better word for it. You know, all you have to do, there's a website which is shocking to show by these white people. This is where I get attacked personally a lot, you know. some of the most banal. It's not subtle. It's not the kind of subtle racism which sometimes I myself fall into without knowing it, because as you've been socialized, and sometimes somebody has to point it out, this is banal. You know, this is really like England in exactly after the war. I was watching a play yesterday from London. It was called Small Island. People from Jamaica who went to London and the racism they experienced. So yeah, in the schools, I think we need to do more. The curriculum, the documents that's been talking about multiculturalism. I find it a bit soft, that word multiculturalism. Because multiculturalism for me has a much broader meaning than just even in terms of language, correct, anti-rape in education, education. We have a lot of that discourse. Race relations issues are new, relatively.
So I think Peter has
Some
or
breaks
connection right
in
now.
connection.
Peter, we lost your, yeah, okay, you're back.
Okay, you're here. Okay.
We couldn't hear the last bits, actually.
I can see a familiar face there, Kanan. Kanan, how do you say that? In Boadici.
Canan.
Canan.
Hi Peter. Canan.
Yeah, hi. Merhaba.
Merhaba.
How are
Nice
you?
to see you. Nice to see you again.
Yeah.
Very well. I'm happy to see you.
Okay, so hi, Canan Hocam, it's nice to see you. You know, today we are around 70, 80 people, and we have a lot of educators, critical educators from Turkey. I would like to ask, you know, viewed from afar, how do you assess efforts in critical pedagogy in Turkey?
Very highly. Certainly the two institutions I'm familiar with, and I'll add another one, which is not an academic institution. So you have in Turkey really good stuff taking place. I've seen with my own eyes, and people have suffered for it. So you have literally, everybody suffers in a particular way. Paulo Freire was sent to exile. Henry Jerrold lost his tenure, you know.
Okay, I think there's the issue again.
Okay. Let's wait, Eda.
Okay, Peter, we lost you. The connection. Sometimes the video, you know. Oh, I think we got.
All right.
Oh, okay. Here you are.
Okay, so I was talking about, the question was critical pedagogy in Turkey. I was last in Turkey in 2013. And no, I actually went to Malatya afterwards. And there are three institutions where I think critical pedagogy is very strong in Turkey, from what I see from afar. I don't know what's going on in Turkey, but it's from afar. I remember Jerry Kachur, the late Jerry, and myself and Carmel taught at Boğaziçi. And we just had Hanan from Boğaziçi. And I thought it was very strong there. And the students were disposed towards critical pedagogy. We did adult education, my class. I know they did political economy with Jerry Kachur, reading Marx, etc. And of course, Ankara, thanks to Hasan Aksoy, and I got to meet Kemal Inal, There's a lot of interesting stuff going on. And then you have this journal, which is called Elistere. I don't know how I pronounce it. I don't know. Elistere Pedagogy, which means critical
Pedagogy.
Very good.
In Turkish. What I find fascinating about Turkey, issues of critical pedagogy are also raised in newspapers on the left. You find stuff in Sol, you find stuff in Birgun, is the other one. Birgun, is that how we say it, Birgun?
Yes, Birgun, yes.
Yeah, Birgun.
Correct.
So that's interesting. And what is fascinating is how critical pedagogy or critical education should be. There is no barrier between academia, schools, and outside. There is an invisible line. And this is interesting. And how the students themselves are mobilized to participate in demonstrations against a government which, of course, is not very sympathetic towards critical pedagogy and this kind of stuff. And the professors go with them in the streets. You know, like, I found that a lovely touch. We participated with some of the participants, the students, and the profs has to be with them. I have to be with my students. And they could be tear gassed, etc. So yes, on both sides, both theoretically and also, you know, it's inextricably intertwined. And people have lost their jobs, for Christ's sake, in your cities. And people from critical pedagogy, precisely because they're doing critical pedagogy. So yeah, I don't want to teach Turkey to the Turks. These are impressions I have. I don't know Turkey. I'm from the outside. You can say much better than I do. But my impression, correct me if I'm wrong, is you will find this mostly in the cities as opposed to the hinterland because of the challenge of secularization, which probably goes back to Mustafa Kemal, etc. You find it. I found this institution. And then there's another institution I would mention, which is your teachers' union, Eğitim Sen. They've sponsored conferences on critical education. They would have their own hotel in Ankara. There's a very strong liaison between academics involved in critical sociology and critical education and the union, not the one which the government set up, Bir Sen, Eğitim Sen. So, you know, like these are three strong institutions in terms of critical pedagogy. And you get so many speakers over to review up, so to speak, from Marxist theorists like Burton Dolman to Michael Apple comes here very often. And he sends his regards to everybody, by the way, because he wrote to me recently. He was ill and now he's recovering and he, nothing serious, no COVID, whatever. And he sends his regards and he keeps telling me, you know, people are losing their jobs over there, etc. Of course, he's very much involved with the teachers' union. It's part of his makeup. I once even tried to encourage Henry Giroud to come to Turkey. I said, don't miss an opportunity to go to Turkey because you're going to find some wonderful people, teachers, cultural workers, and students. I mean, the students I had in Turkey were amongst the most radical I've had in my teaching. And I've taught in Canada, I taught in many other places, Germany, etc. Some of the most radical I had were at Boğaziçi. And I see the same thing here, but I didn't teach here, seminars. So I think, yeah, it is a tough situation, especially with the government you have. But I mean, all the plaudits go to the people who stick their neck out and for critical pedagogy, and you keep going. I mean, you know, like the putsch. I don't know if it's an orchestrated putsch. You can teach me about this, because you know it looked orchestrated to me. It looked so amateurish, which led to the clean sweep of left-wingers when these guys have nothing to do with religion, and at the same time he's blaming, your president is blaming, the prime minister is blaming Fatih Gülen, the Gülen movement, and that's, what has somebody like Kemal got to do with the Gülen movement, for example? You know, it was an opportunity to purge some critical pedagogues. I find that shocking. I find that obnoxious. At the same time, I admire the people concerned that they keep going, they keep producing. Not only they produce one journal, now they produce a second one, rethinking critical pedagogy, etc. Yeah, you take it very seriously. And yeah, it's not just it is not treated, I'm not saying it gets treated like this in other places, but it's not treated simply as an intellectual exercise. It is more than that. It is praxis in the real sense of the word. So I'm very impressed. And I do mention when I write, but of course my knowledge is that of somebody who is distantly located. I am not Turkish and I don't live in Turkey.
Okay, Peter, before the next question, I'd like to address...
Sorry, can I ask you a question? How do you see critical pedagogy in your own country?
You know, you mentioned about that. We are having eleştirel pedagogy published for many years. It's a rooted journal now, and it's very functional. Mm-hmm. I think, and it is in Turkish. That you have been, referring some problems in translation of especially Freire's terms, and we are having the same problems in translation. We read in English, for example, we try to understand it, and then we try to convey it correctly to our students. But eleştirel pedagogy, the journal published in Turkish, has a section, dictionary section.
Okay.
And yes. It functions, yes, for a very, very useful aim. And it reaches out to Turkish readers, especially about these terms, that may have, some incorrect translations. Okay. This is very important. And this is praxis. Yes, you said this. This is praxis. A good example of praxis. And second, Kemal Ünal is here now. He initiated another critical pedagogy journal, Rethinking Critical Pedagogy. It will be published in English, but still it's a Turkish movement, we can say, right, Kemal?
First of all, I have some connection problems, and I couldn't find any opportunity and time to hear you, Peter Mayo, all the time.
Well, you've heard me, and I've heard you. I said you heard me before, and I've heard you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm very glad to hear and to be a part of this very invaluable community this evening. Yes, we have not very long time or story about critical pedagogy. I think the first attempt in Turkey in the area of critical pedagogy was begun with the publication of eleştirel pedagogy. And as you know, because you have an article in our new journal called Rethinking Critical Pedagogy, which is published in only English. This is very new attempt or very new initiative in opening new horizons in critical pedagogy, especially in terms of practical field studies, because in critical pedagogy all over the world, there are some problems to be solved. So these problems, I think, should be reformulated in new approaches. So it depends on the it depends on having a new horizon, especially in the field studies. because critical pedagogy is very full of theory of theories.
Yeah, I
Theory
once
of
said that. One of
theories.
the conferences there, yes.
So we need
On the ground, on the ground.
yeah, we need studies to open a new horizons in the critical pedagogy. As a underdeveloped country, we have many facts to be studied in terms of critical pedagogical problems, but we need, I think, a new approach based on the field studies.
Yeah, yes. I agree.
So I tried to do this with the last book on the relationships between power and teachers in a public school. This is my book, and this my book was published last year. So this book was an applied study on the behaviors, decisions, resistance of the teachers in a public school. So I think the critical pedagogy is progressing in Turkey because we have very invaluable colleagues and many people in trade unions and teachers in the schools. So this is very good attempt for us in Turkey.
Okay. And I'm very impressed by I'm impressed also by the union, the A18SEM, which is, for many years, it seems to provide the wherewithal to organize things, conferences on critical pedagogy, etc., which is amazing. You got the teachers union involved.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kemal Hocam, and thank you, Peter. Yes, regarding your question, you know, one part of critical pedagogy in Turkey is publications. And bigger part of these critical pedagogy publications are translations. So we are having at the moment in this meeting, we are having so many colleagues who contributed to translation work. It's a big labor, you know.
Yeah.
We have to appreciate this. We have to mention this.
Indeed.
It's a big labor. Kemal Hoca knows, and Hasan Hüseyin Hoca knows, and people here are really, you know, doing very, very valuable work. And we are still, you know, struggling from the publishing houses, you know. They charge, you know, fees for the copyright, and they don't want to be so willing to publish. Publication part is very important, and translation is important, as we are in Turkey and we need to read in Turkish. Another part is the unions. You know, ATIMSEN is a very big union, and there are others, you know, there are other teachers unions, very small, maybe small networks. Yeah, critical pedagogy is in progression in Turkey, and we are having the actors, main actors of this critical pedagogy effort in Turkey here now at the moment in our meeting. And I try to mention some of the names here, and I'm very proud, and I'm very happy that we are having here them, and I want to welcome, and I want to continue with the next question, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, Eda.
Thank you, Hocam. So, Peter, I would like to ask about your recent book. It is on higher education, and we received some questions on higher education. So your most recent book is Higher Education in a Globalizing World, Community Engagement and Lifelong Learning, and it was published by University of Manchester Press. So tell us something about this book.
Thank you very much. Talking about books, I need to say this, and briefly about the previous question. I appreciate the translations which take place in Turkey, because one of the most amazing things, both for the late Jerry, Kachur, and myself, is that when we used to come to Turkey and we go to the kitab, the bookshops, you translate everything here. Every author you can think of is translated into Turkish. And that is amazing. So, you know, I've always been amazed about this thing about Turkey. And the other thing is my book now. Okay, this book was published actually around about this time a year ago. I'm going to work on 3 books now, co-authored. I don't know how we're going to do this, but over the next few years. And that was my last book, and it was published July, I believe it was July 2019. I had been writing some pieces on higher education, so I thought I would put them together and, you know, create some conceptualization between them to unify the whole idea into a coherent whole. But what I do is I look at the dominant discourse in higher education, bring out the contradictions of that discourse. I've been doing that for a number of years. I look mostly at the European discourse, the European Union. I had written a paper and I built on it some time ago actually, where I read practically all the communications on higher education which came out of the EU. And then I kept reading about it. And what I do is I move from, okay, this is the dominant discourse. We have these chapters, the political economy of universities. But then I try to be, what I do is a critical pedagogy of higher education. I argue that we have been for quite a number of years at a crossroads. We've had a number of choices in front of us. I tend to agree with the idea that universities have to change. The old concept, if it ever was brought into existence, but it was a concept of the Humboldt tradition, which is problematic. It's very elitist. It's very white-centric. It's very, elitist, built on the whole idea of Bildung, etc. That concept, people harken back to it. They always keep referring to it to try and defend the humanities and social sciences. But I have a problem with it. So I say, yes, how do we organize alternative higher education? And making it closer to the aspirations, the cultures, the ethnicities of people who are now changing our communities. And primarily what I do is I look at an experiment which I was involved in. In fact, I partly designed it, this course, which we carried out with people from a particular locality in Malta. And we looked for something which captures the imagination of the people in that particular community and how to build on it to make knowledge much more related to their interests, their passion, and of course, their also community life. Now, we chose a religious element, which is not religious. It's religious and it isn't, because it became folklore. It became part of people's imagination. It's an area, like many others, it's not the only one, where what Gramsci calls the popular creative spirit comes out. And we called it, this is what happens in a Catholic country where religion is both religious and profane. Because you could be an atheist, but you participate in this thing because of the creativity involved. It's a communal tradition. There's an identity involved. And we looked at what in Spain they call La Semana Santa, the Holy Week. Now Spain, and we have this juxtaposition between Malta, Spain, Italy, etc. And if you want to look about the relationship between Good Friday, the Holy Week, and politics, you don't look further than Spain, because it's all political, and the politics is all played out. All the history of Spain gets played out into it. Republican versus phalangist, or versus, you know, nationalist. It's all played out in this thing. And we look at similarities in Malta. So what can a person, whether she is religious or not, garner from that aspect of Maltese popular creative spirit? And I have a whole chapter on that. I think it's the most empirical chapter in this, where I straddle different contexts. Malta, a bit of Italy. I even use theater from Italy, and of course, España. And I've been in discussions with colleagues from Spain, in Seville, particularly Seville, about this issue. I also seek advice from a very good friend of mine in Spain, who's an expert on this issue, on the politics of these issues, anti-Franco, of course. I mean, we don't pretend, I never pretend to be neutral. I try to be fair, but not neutrality doesn't come into this, you know. And I also watch Spanish television. So on Monday, Thursday, on Good Friday, I'm glued to the television. I don't sleep. I watch the rituals as if you are there, and you actually see them much better than there. And I look at the politics of it, and then we come up with ideas how this can be turned, this thing which captures people's imagination, both religiously, I'm not denying that, or not. How can that be turned into an emancipatory project? What does the whole issue of the Mater Dolorosa tell us about women? So we look at people who have written about women, and you know, like, who are critical of it. The Paragon of Excellence, which women cannot be like, Italian feminists of the 60s. Ne puttane ne madonne, solo semplicemente donne. But then we look at people like Giulia Kristeva, about the Stabat Mater, what she talks about. So how do we look at how can this teach us to discuss the issue of gender in an emancipatory way? We talk about imperialism and colonialism. This thing happened in a imperial context, and an imperial context then, and an imperial context now. So we've got Palestine in the time of the Romans, and we also have Palestine today, which is also imperial, settler colonialism. So the issue of the settler colonialist project, Zionist settler colonial projects, comes into it. We talk about theater, the evolution of theater from the Middle Ages, because theater plays a very important part. It's all theatrical. Theater in the streets, theater also on stage, the pageant, the miracle plays of old come into this. And today, in terms of community theater, and we look at, okay, Boal, as always, but we also look at Garcia Lorca and his La Barraca. It's all in that book. And then I look at the various projects taking place, which are not mainstream higher education, but they're taking place. They are different pockets. People will laugh at them. They will deride them. You know, you ain't getting anything from this. Well, we'll see. History will tell us, because the changes we find today were laughed at in the past. And they are mostly from below. This is democracy from below. So we look at experiments in Chiapas of alternative universities. We look at Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who, by the way, endorsed the book. He wrote one of the endorsements. We look at the University of Social Movements of the World Social Forum. I look at Brazil, which is resisting Bolsonaro, which is the Escola Nacional Florestan Fernandes. Last time I couldn't remember the name. It's mostly connected, not the way we understand it today. It's more like the medieval concept, but more public. It's for common people, not for theologians or people who are Quranists, Quranist scholars. These are now for public social movements. People go there, they get their training, they mix with others and go back into the social movement. So we have the same Unitierra in Chiapas. We have Florestan Fernandes, which survives because there's a movement behind it. There's the MST. MST means the Movimiento Sem Terra, the Landless Peasant Movement. That is why it survived, because you've got a government which is hell-bent on destroying this thing. It already, the interim government already did it, but when you've got education, can help change things, but it cannot do it on its own. You know this. This is a maxim in critical sociology and critical pedagogy. We should not give education powers it does not have. Education on its own doesn't change things, but it can contribute together with others. In Brazil, there's a huge movement which connects with others, you know, different campesinas and campesinos in different parts, campesas in Portuguese, I think it is, campesas, everywhere. The Workers' Party of Lula was very much involved, also a party which was open to movements without taking them over, because the movements want to retain their identity. And so they're very much afraid when they work with the state, even though it's their party, which dominates the state, because they don't want to be co-opted. And these movements, how all these come together and provide the bastion, the bulwark, if you like, for this movement to survive. It's a two-way process. The movement supports the party, and the party supports the movement. And I see a concept of a new concept, a new public university emerging from it. University as a group of people. In the Middle Ages was scholars or Quranic scholars, because in the Arab world, they started before Europe, of course. And of course, today, it's not this, it's the social movements. It's the popular parties where these exist, etc. So I'm looking at universities in that respect. Yeah. And the problems with the modern technology today, you know, like MOOCs and things like that. Look at all that, the different chapters. Mm-hmm. There's a lot in that book, not because I wrote it. One problem, there's one big problem. It's too expensive. Problem.
Thank you. You mentioned, as you were, talking about the books, you mentioned some paragons of excellence, right? Are there paragons of excellent critical education in the Mediterranean area, in which our respective countries are located?
Definitely. I mean, definitely. I mean, you are an example with Pedagogy, whatever. I mean, great things happened in this part of the world, and the first universities were born here. The ones that we know of. Of course, there are the Chinese academies, but I mean, the first universities are in the Arab countries, in Egypt, and which are extant, which still exist, and in Fez, in Morocco. You have great scholars who have a lot to give to critical education, even though they were they were a long time ago, and they are not given credit for one very simple reason. In the West, they're not given credit, although now people are giving them credit because they were Muslim. So, don't expect the centers of Paris, for example, to give credit to a sociologist, historian, philosopher who lived in so many years ago in the 14th century, who said most of the things that Emil Durkheim said about solidarity. I'm referring to Ibn Khaldun. So we've always had this tradition over here. We have a tradition of open theater. So critical pedagogy has furnished us with great figures. And of course, I think, like in Latin America and other places, the rhythm of life here has allowed a particular kind of education to take place. Unfortunately, this has been taken over by our life world, which depends historically on the climatic conditions, amongst other things, which help produce a particular kind of pedagogy in this part of the world. Is being taken over by a Nordist pedagogy, where the rhythm of life is completely different. And that's where you have your lifelong learning coming out of the EU, which rides roughshod over the traditions of lifelong learning in the South. So I think there's a challenge here. There is a big challenge. There are great centers of critical pedagogy. I'm sure there are many in the Arab countries, certainly in Palestine. In Palestine, there's some great stuff going on critical pedagogy. And I wrote a piece with a Palestinian on this issue about Freire in Palestine. She had the on the ground because she works there, and I had the Freire stuff. When we put it together, we published it in Holy Land. So Palestine actually is one of the most interesting places. I think it's one of the most intellectually advanced amongst critical theory amongst Arabs. Egypt too. Egypt always had a great tradition. Theater, public theater. We mentioned Boal, but you have Al-Washa, which is a theater group in the Middle East. They go into communities. They discuss issues in the communities. This is also critical pedagogy. Call it community education. This is also critical pedagogy. The kind of stuff that Boal did recently, but before he died, but even Garcia Lorca did this. Federico Garcia Lorca, when he was a student of law, used to go around with his La Barraca group, and they used to tackle issues like poverty. This was during the Second Republic, which was like a big revolution in Spain. And then you had the counter-revolution of Franco. That was a big revolution in Spain. We talk about Nicaragua today, but its antecedent would be the Second Republic in Spain. There are tremendous things taking place. And you had theater. You've had literacy, which many people were illiterate in Spain. It all happened there. So we have critical pedagogues there. There are centers today. You talk about CREC or the Paulo Freire Institute, the amount of work they do in the Valencia region. We also have CREA, which is based in Barcelona, where even they use literary figures work to be able to teach literacy. We have, remember the tradition in Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia existed, the old country Yugoslavia under Tito. People laugh at this thing today. The whole idea of education for industrial democracy because of the self-managed management. The cooperative movement, one of the biggest movements in the cooperative movement was in the Basque territory in Spain. I was a priest. The thing about critical pedagogy in this part of the world is you cannot, it's like Mexico and Latin America. You cannot often separate it from religion. Southern Europe, countries around the Mediterranean, have strong religions. Islam on one side, Islam in Turkey, and you also have Catholicism in many countries, Spain.
Okay, while we are waiting for him to reconnect, we are about to finish our interview today because it's been more than 1 hour, I guess. There are many questions, you know, I see streaming on the right-hand side here. Thank you for your interest to ask these questions and comments. But I don't know how to deal with the time issue and which ones can we ask here. Maybe not all of them, maybe 1 or 2 questions from you can be asked. If Peter Mayo can reconnect us, of course. We can do, you know, we function or we spread information and knowledge at different platforms. It is always called Global Thursday Talks. We have Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube channel. And we are going to organize some reading meetings, reading platforms, for example, reading Peter Mclaren, reading Senese, reading Mayo, and these can be, of course, open to everyone who are interested in reading and discussing these educators, you know, writings. Mainly their recent articles and recent books, and these will be discussions over those readings. you can ask your questions. Maybe there some of our guests are interested. For example, Guy Senese, I talked to him yesterday. He said he is interested in joining on these reading meetings. Maybe Peter Mayo can appear in our meetings, reading meetings, and you can ask some of your questions to him there, because we really have some problems with technology. First of all, he's not here still, right?
No.
And with time considerations. Okay, maybe we can call him.
Can maybe I can add, I'm going to save the chat box and I'll make sure the questions are listed and sent to Peter Mayo.
Mm-hmm.
And if you would like to send your comments or some more questions, as I can see here, I put our email address on the chat box.
Eda, what about starting reading the questions here on the right-hand side, so that we can, maybe some of these questions asked here answered already, because Peter touched upon many critical issues, many different things.
Peter is here, hocam.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm back.
Nice to see you.
Welcome back.
Yeah, the battery went off. I'm surprised, but anyway.
Okay, no problem.
Now, when you record it, you can edit it, this part. You can edit this.
Okay.
So I was talking about, in the Mediterranean. So there's a lot going on. I mentioned Brazil, I mentioned Yugoslavia, I mentioned Spain. We have some great figures also in the Mediterranean. I think I've written a lot about Don Lorenzo Milani, a very important critical pedagogue. I think he and the boys at Barbiana, they anticipate a lot of things which came out in sociology of education. I mean, I've been writing a lot about him to promote him within critical pedagogy or critical education, whatever. So, and you got the connection, this is where I broke off, between religion and education. You cannot separate the two. They are part of the fabric, the social fabric. Now, this will create issues now because of migration. There will be issues here. There are going to be tensions. But if you look at Italy, for example, you will find that many of the best critical pedagogues, you have a lot of secular people, and Italy has produced a lot, from Ada Gobetti, a partisan woman who dedicated her life to teaching afterwards, to Danilo Dolci in Sicily. And then you've got Don Milani, you've got a lot of priests doing a lot of interesting work. Don Bosco about play, as opposed to Don Milani, but Don Milani is the person. And one of the best works is Letter to a Teacher, was translated into Turkish. It's published in Turkey. It's by the students of Don Milani. So we have a lot over there. In Spain, you've got, in Catalonia, you have, for example, one of the most anarchist, a leading anarchist who has written a lot about education, which is Ferreri Guardia. So there's another famous priest in Italy, in Spain, who was very much responsible for the cooperative whole ensemble, which is Mondragon. Is extremely important. So, and then you remember also what happened post coup d'etat, post-revolution in places like Portugal and also Spain, with the whole idea of regional autonomy, the amount of community work which returned to the surface, which was hidden under Franco, it still went on. It still went on under the radar, so to speak, which drew a lot from Latin America because of the cultural affinity between the two countries. So you have a lot of this kind of work. Right now, what is interesting, you can call this a form of critical education, is the kind of education to recover, recapture the hinterland, because many people in Spain and Portugal, they migrate towards the coast. And now they're creating a kind of rural university. Now, this is in my book. I have it in the book on higher education. A rural university, very much inspired by the likes, I would say, very similar at least, of what Tolstoy did in Russia, and also what Tagore, the national poet, did in India, preparing people for rural life, the rural university. And you have the same thing now in Spain and Portugal, so that people will now learn to become self-reliant, as Nyerere said, in the context of a rural area, rather than move towards and have this demographic imbalance that you find in these places. So there's a lot. There is what we say in English, much grist for the mill in terms of critical pedagogy and critical education, call what you like, coming from this part of the world. And of course, we need to discover more about the Arab world, but certainly I'm seeing a lot of writings now about universities going back now to Ibn Khaldun, which is interesting. We used to have Ibn Khaldun taught at our university by a certain priest who's no longer with us, and he was our rector in the 70s. But now you have Boaventura de Sousa Santos has a whole chapter on Ibn Khaldun in his Decolonizing University. We also have Rewin Connell writing about the good university, devotes a lot of space to Ibn Khaldun. This guy's in Australia. This woman is in Australia. So, okay. So you got Australia, you got Portugal, United States, because De Sousa Santos is also in the United States, etc. So people from this part of the world are resurfacing. And then you have the social movements. And also, I think what is important is we have to reclaim knowledge which gets appropriated from parts of the world, and this applies not just to the Mediterranean. Think of India. How much knowledge, indigenous knowledge, is stolen, patented, and made to appear as if it's a Western discovery, and it's basically either Indian or other parts of the world. The Mediterranean also suffers from this. And I'm not referring to the Greco-Roman tradition. I'm talking about ordinary knowledge. Experiments which took place, for example, Italy is the country I know best because I know the language. Experiments which were taken up by other countries and as if they discovered it. For example, things like, it's never too late to learn. That was an Italian program in the 60s. The European Union has adopted it, etc. We call this cognitive injustice. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that respect. Also, the whole idea of grassroots democracy for peace, and so that you don't have a fascist experience again. You know, grassroots democracy, learning for grassroots democracy. Well, that happened in Italy at the end of the Second World War with the likes of people like Aldo Capitini. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot. So, yeah.
Okay, Peter, talking about Mediterranean, you know, this region is very, very valuable for us, and we owe to this culture, Mediterranean culture. And for us, maybe our researchers in critical pedagogy, our students in critical pedagogy will be interested in the subjects to research for, to seek for, that you have mentioned now, because this is our you know, heritage. This is our legacy, and we owe this. We owe some intellectual work to this culture.
Yes. And of course, you've been doing this stuff in sociology of education about sociologists who came out of Turkey, you know, who did, I mentioned Ibn Khaldun because, let's put it this way, my knowledge of the Arab world is very limited, even though I speak a tongue, Maltese, which derives from Arabic, you know, and there's, I'm sure, also there's so much which happened in the Mediterranean. When you talk about I gave a talk once here in the World Congress of Comparative with Jerry. Jerry, that was very daring. He spoke about Ataturk. I spoke about Omar al-Mukhtar. Omar al-Mukhtar, who was very, people knew him in Turkey very much because of the Muslim connection. Omar al-Mukhtar led a rebellion against the fascists in Italy. He was a teacher. He was a Quranic teacher. And what did he do? Typical guerrilla warfare. When they used to meet, they used to hide in the Jebel Lahdar, which is in Libya. In Libya, we're talking about here. He used to teach them not how to fight, but how to learn how to read and write. Obviously, to read the Quran, to learn how to read. Now, this anticipates something which got magnified in the literature, especially in the United States. Sandino, Cesar Augusto Sandino, in the fame, was exalted by the revolution in Nicaragua, even though there's a huge gap between him and the revolution. But you know how it is. We always have to harken back to an idol from the past. It's like Omar al-Mukhtar for Libya, for Gaddafi, did the same thing. You know, he did the same thing by insisting that the guerrillas fighting against the Americans, the Marines, the Yanks, teach them also how to read and write. And the whole sort of philosophy of education emerged out of it. So this whole idea of learning also in guerrilla practice, there was something which Che Guevara did also in Congo. It's something which we also find examples here. And of course, prison education. Prison education is another important thing.
Yes.
You find it everywhere. Some revolutionary education took place in prisons. And I don't have to mention Gramsci and the school of Ustica, because there were other places where these things happened. Palestinians still do it today in Ansar number 3, in the Negev desert. They have a committee, people teaching each other. You prepare this, I prepare this, I'm an expert in this, I can teach this, but I can learn this at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Shows one thing, that although the teacher is important, critical pedagogue, but societies always had this historical ability to organize their own education.
Mm-hmm.
You had, did you have an education tent when you were organizing in Gezi Park? Like the Occupy movement. We have to look at those. Those are on the ground examples that Kemal told us about.
Yes. Yes. We are trying to organize, you know, we are having one big union that already established with Guy Sinis and his team and a group of people from Turkey. This
Sure.
is another important point. But we are running out of time. How do you feel, Peter? Would you like to answer some more questions from our participants, or?
Okay, as they say, the night is young. So, you know, I don't sleep before 3 o'clock in the morning, so.
Okay.
I'm not going to mark exams now. I'm not in the mood for that. So you can go ahead if you like.
Okay, thank you for this.
Have people signed out? I don't know. Probably.
They are here. People
Okay,
are not leaving.
But you know, I had that mishap of the computer. Jesus. But anyway.
Okay, no problem. Okay, this is technology. It happens.
No, we are Mediterranean. We are Mediterranean. We fixed. No,
okay.
We create our own stereotypes now. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Then let's continue with the questions from participants. Eda, some of the questions have already been covered here.
Yeah, I was going.
Would you like to start? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There was a question on Malta and critical education. I think.
You asked me that question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It has been answered. There are two questions on village institutions in Turkey. I would like to start with that. Tuğçe Hocam and Ali Hocam asks, have you read about village institutes in Turkey?
Village institute, village, I'm not sure. We had two people, students, I think, who came to Malta and they presented to us in our faculty. They used to go into a village to do some kind of popular education. Is this what it is? It sounds like it. They came over all the way and to give us a presentation on this. What's this village institute? Is it?
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
Yes, this is a question was by me. It is an.
What's your name?
My name is Tuğçe.
Tuğçe.
We met in Napoli last year.
Oh, you were there?
Yes, I was with Ahmet Yıldız.
Oh, yeah. So we met from the airport.
Yes. How are you? It's good to see you. It's good to hear from you.
Yeah.
Village Institutes, I was interested in it. I mean, I have been interested in it. It's an institution, it's a school initiated in 1930s in Turkey to spread education, getting the young village girls and boys and having them learn by doing. It is partially, and then they go back to their hometowns and they start teaching farming and other daily routines, etc., teaching and learning. There is a lot of philosophical background behind it, and the guy who was the Ministry of Education, who was into the Ministry of Education, but it's the topic that is not very much published in Turkey. There is one article that I translated from Turkey, written by one of my friends who is here, Murat Kaymak. Maybe I will send it to you. I will send the article to you. It
would be great if we can
grow the picture, but you got to add me in the Facebook first, because I have been requesting a friendship. You are not accepting any friends.
Okay, all right, okay. I probably forgot the meeting.
Okay, Tuğçe, thank you.
It is important to get this literature out in the public domain.
Yes, we got to write more in English, and we got to publish more. A lot of potential.
About education, we have a book series. I'm reading that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was thinking of contrasting Freire and Tonguç, the brain of these schools in Turkey. Then I changed my mind, etc. When I read your book about Mayo, about Gramsci and Freire, it inspired.
That was translated by Ahmet Duman.
Ahmet Duman, yes, he's my teacher as well, the professor.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tuğçe. Thank you for your question. And let's take the next question. Thank you, Tuğçe.
So the next question is about what would an institution of higher education that follows critical pedagogy do and not do? What would it look like organizationally?
How would a Freire university be?
Yeah.
Right? Can you give me a second? Let me get a book from behind me, because I wrote this in an interview. Okay, just a second. Because I answered that question in this book.
Sure.
Aha. Yeah. All right. So this here is the 50th anniversary publication of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's been published by Bloomsbury, paperback, and there's our friend Peter Mclaren, of course, here. Noam Chomsky's here. Anyway, they interviewed a number of people after they gave the whole exposition of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And we had to answer some questions. So I'm here. And one of the questions, and I mentioned CREA, there was Ramon Flecha from CREA, Marina Barberan, Gustavo Finchman, Noam Chomsky. Ramon Flecha, Ronald Glass, I'm looking mine, Valerie Kinich. Okay, here I am. And this is a standard question. They asked us this question. What do you think a Freire university would look like today? And I answered, to the best of my ability, this way. It would be one wherein the institution and the education it provides are conceived, are imagined as public goods, not a consumption good to begin with. Now, universities today, the more they become more consumer oriented. We don't even refer to students as students now, but we refer to them as consumers, even if they get paid, like at our place. We are assessed on our courses as you would assess a consumption thing, a consumption good. So there's a lot of this going on. So it has to be still a public and not a consumption good. It's different. It's very difficult today to talk of a public or a private. It's really difficult to separate the two. You may have nominally a public institution, but so much, what's the word, outsourcing takes place. That where's the private and where's the public? I teach at a university. I remember when we used to go and eat, there was staff employed by the institution. There was a sense of collegiality. Today, no, you have a company, etc. The cleaners were employed by the university. Now, no, you've got a company. Subcontracting is the word, right? So they have to be not consumption goods. Universities to be cheap, not like today. Just give you an example. The University of Malta started being free 1971. Let's take England. Let's take England. In 1977, listen to this. I applied and joined a distance education. We used to call them external degrees, degree courses. I'm sure there are people in Turkey who have these. From the University of London, many people had this. You know how much it cost me to register? At pittance, a mere £25, which is nothing, to register. Then I had the exams, would probably cost me 60 Maltese lira, right? It was nothing. Today, to register, it will cost you, I don't know, a king's ransom, I suppose. Today, Oxford University is offering an online program, because they got used to it because of COVID, right? Like we're doing here, for 1 or 2 years, which is equivalent to the first year of a degree, but you only get a certificate. A certificate, not even a diploma. And that costs £8,000 sterling. All right? I mean, just to give you the situation. In America, forget it when it comes to money. So it will be one where engagement with the community in a Freirean university or in a critical pedagogy university would be given central importance. It would be one where the starting point for learning is the student's existential situation, with knowledge deriving from thematic complexes. Now I'll explain this. Researched within and emerging from the community. This is very Freirean, right? It will be one in which the transmission model, the transmission is banking education, where I just give you knowledge, information. The transmission model of lecturing is replaced by co-investigation. So dialogue plays a very important part, involving lecturers, students, and community members who are only defined like that, but in actual fact, they are all teachers and students at the same time, which are raised, they are debating issues raised in a manner that arouses epistemological curiosity and becomes a dynamic process, because it's interactive. So knowledge changes, it's not static. It becomes the object of a collective inquiry. So less individualism, more collective. Can you imagine this happening in this current university situation? Not on your life. So it's a total opposite of what happens today. We talk about, first of all, a public, it's not just the fees, but what you teach. You teach public issues. You give importance to the public, not simply business the way we know it today. So political economy, etc. People's economy, people's lives we have to discuss, okay? Secondly, environmental issues. We just don't justify an economic theory because it works for industrialization if it's creating mayhem in terms of our habitats. there is a planet which we have to hand over to the next generation who lent it to us in the first place. What are we going to give them? Everything has its pros and cons. The other thing is important thing. This is important. We have to move away from this idea of compartmentalization. We cannot be an expert on everything, but we have to move away from somebody like, I don't know, an economist in Chile. We all know what happened. They went to Chicago, got the training on their what's the name of the the neoliberal economist, Milton Friedman, and they don't give a damn about the rest of humanity because this is the theory, the economic theory. No, you have to ask sociological questions. You have to ask also environmental questions. You know, you can't say, this is the realm of sociology. This is the realm of environmental studies. This is pure economics. No, economics have their consequences. They have casualties. So you have to deal about that. We just cannot do this, you know. And also, therefore, environmental issues come in. What are the environmental consequences of what you're teaching? What are the human consequences of what you're teaching? So that's it. So that's what I mean when I say it has to be a public and not a consumption good. And also, it has to be very relational. It's about relations between human beings amongst themselves as a social entity, which always happens, but also in terms of human-earth relationship. Relationship is not just with other people, but with the rest of the cosmos, you know? And yeah, I mean, there's so many things you can say, but and then the other thing is, first, you relate what you're teaching to the natural habitat of the people, the existential situation. And then you move from there to higher knowledge. Now, this is something which Paulo Freire spoke about. Gramsci did not. Paulo Freire did. Paulo Freire, when he was Minister of Education in the municipality of Sao Paulo, the teachers who joined the program would first go into the community, see what, with members of the community, see what the issues are, codify them into a university. This is the system for adult education transposed to university. And rather than teach, for example, physics, science, etc., teach that issue, because that is what interests people. You have a dead river in Sao Paulo. I saw it. You've got there. So that would be the starting point. People are connected with it. Talk about poverty, etc. Going to school on an empty stomach. You know, this is the reality. And then once people get this, you move into the subjects. And Dani did the same thing. Yeah. The wall of a church next to their school caved in, and what happened was they found bones. And of course, people were excited about the kids, you know. So Domilani picked them up. This is going to be our lesson today. And they started teaching about the bones, etc. And they started moving into in anatomy, etc. And then they move into the subjects. The casual motive to the profound motive. In Italian is motivo casuale, motivo profondo. Motivo occasionale, the casual motive, to the profound motive. And I think a Freirean university will be like this. So interesting to look at Escuela Nacional Florestan Fernandez, to what extent it is Freirean in terms of its approach.
Thank you very much. There is another question by Arturo Ramirez, and it has
from Ecuador.
From Ecuador, yeah. Thank you, dear Ramirez, for showing up. The question is on community adult education. Community adult education is key to political participation and citizenship, and there is a need to rescue community work within adult education across the world, where the people's stories can become the focus of minor and major political changes within society. So, are there any initiatives present in Europe that have taken the time to collect or rescue these community processes for critical participation?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of community work which is being promoted in Europe. There always has been community work. Now, this is interesting. When I first went, I came back from Alberta in 1988, and I was sent to a conference in Strasbourg I was green. This was my first conference ever, except an academic conference that I attended. And I was representing my country on this conference. And they were deciding, the Council of Europe it was, because we were not in the EU at the time, was the Council of Europe, which is interesting. And I noticed a split between the representatives in terms of what the issues were. The people from the north, now I'm not saying there's no community work in the north. Go to Denmark, the folk high schools, they have a very strong communal element. But people from the North and Central Europe were focusing on single issues. They were focusing on the long-term unemployed and the aging, and they were going to be split. People in the South, the representative from Italy, representative from Greece, who's still active in adult education today, and the Greek Secretariat for the people from Portugal, the people from Cyprus, the people from Spain, and probably Malta as well. We were focusing more on a holistic approach rather than a piecemeal approach, rather than a particularistic. And I could feel this tension between the South and the North. And this will come out in a critical pedagogy of the South. There are issues which are not dealt with when you've got it dominated by northern countries. And this tension was a holistic, and the holistic was more community. That's it. They look at the community more holistically rather than, so there is still, and this is the point to register, there was resistance. You are from sociology, some of you. There was still a sense of Gemeinschaft, which is community, Gemeinschaft, where things are looked at holistically. Whereas in the North, you had all the features of a modern society that sociologists have been writing about. It was more Gesellschaft. And it came out in the teens. So traditionally, the South have always had a more community oriented. Now, I'm not saying that one have you know, you can tar everybody with the same brush, because, for example, the Scandinavian countries, especially Denmark, with its the tradition of the folk high school, was very community because it was a very agrarian kind of place when the folk high schools were created. So that's one thing. Of course, there are community in Spain. In Spain, I've seen these things happen a lot. The idea of the campesino school, the connection with Latin America. But they also have their own approach. The school, and their frere is very, very, very popular. Escuela de los Campesinos, for example, I remember meeting somebody talking about the school of the campesinos in a place called Avila. So yeah, I think there's a North-South dimension in this, without, of course, obscuring certain experiments in the North, like Grundvik's ideas in Denmark about community. We tend to be more holistic, I would say, in the South. Of course, that is also under pressure, because the North through the European Union dictates the agenda. The European Union is very Nordist, in my view, despite all the attempts which have been taking place. And because, hello, oh, gone off again. Yes?
You there, Professor?
Yes.
You can hear me. Okay, yes, it's very Nordist, and it has an effect on the South if we're not careful enough. And this is where I see a lot of tension. The tension is between the traditions of the South. The South has traditions, and they would not, some people will not give them up easily. And then you get the North talking about lifelong learning in a very restricted, individualistic, very much related to ICT and very much related to jobs, which is called employability, which doesn't mean you're going to be employed. And of course, the South, because they've joined the Union, gets a lot of money through these projects to the European Union. And what is interesting is to look at the tension, how, for example, you manage to write up a proposal. Some people are experts at this. Thank God for this, because this is how things change. This is how we bring about change. And they circumvent the whole process to make it more holistic, For example, a country like Malta, we should learn this rather than being holier than the Pope. Certain things as dictated by Brussels, by the Commission, okay? This is the Commission who does these things. Not very democratic in that respect. Certain things do not suit a small country. Malta has a population officially of about 400,000, it's probably 700,000 because of the undocumented migrants, okay? But anyway, you have to use something for a specific purpose. Whereas in our country, the cost per capita of duplicating things, one for adults and one for children, is very high because of the small numbers. And sometimes you are restricted from using it for other purposes, making multifunctional use of it because of the regulations coming from Europe. How do you circumvent that? How do you convince Europe that the reality is different? And as people, much more seasoned practitioners than ours, although some people here in Malta are also very, very, very skillful at this, but some people, they know how to do this. In Spain, for example, how they get money from the European Union. And they can sponsor things which are at the furthest remove of what the Commission had in mind. Of course, these are large countries. And because they are large countries, it is interesting to look at what I call the policy trajectory. Because it leaves Brussels, it reaches Spain. So it already changes the moment it reaches Spain, transmutation. Okay, mutation. At the federal level, Madrid. By the time it leaves the federal level to reach the regional level, another change takes place. From the regional level, it has to reach the municipal level. Another change takes place. By the time it gets to the center in a particular village, the whole thing will be mutated to the extent that different agendas, local agendas come in. And there's been some interesting work revealing this process. And my argument is, with so many organizations today, some of them involved in community education, holistic community education, are so dependent today on Europe, on the European Union. This is the way to go about things in the circumstances. And this is the way to be clever, how to, circumvent these kind of things. And now countries who are like Malta recently became recent members, there is a tendency, and I noticed this, that we don't do this. Woe betide us, we stray from the objectives of Lisbon, because we have to show them that we are up. Big Daddy, I'm a good child, I'm a good student. I follow your rules. No. The good student doesn't follow your rules. You make rules and we break them, and that's what an artist will do. An academy makes rules and the artist breaks them. And this is what the countries like Italy and Spain do. I'm amazed. The books that are published, I shouldn't say this because I shouldn't give Brussels ideas. Books on critical education published from money coming from the Deputatio, and which is often money from Europe in the first place. Publishing Habermas, publishing Gramsci. I don't know, they let you. Oh, obviously, they don't read them. That kind of situation. How you get around things to broaden the agenda, not the restrict agenda by which you are tied because of your membership of the European Union. And I think this happens everywhere, in fact. You need clever, it's a Gramscian war of position. It's a guerra di posizione, a war of position. How to fight this bloc. Which, of course, Europe is not to be like any other institution, is not monolithic. You will get support from Brussels. You never know who's working in Brussels. So you have the Commission, but you might have somebody who's working in your project, who's very critical. And I have met one, at least. He was a student of Jeff Whitty at the University of London. And we were evaluators. So, hegemony changes from people within the interstices. And I think this is the hope we have. Because other than that, the money you get from Europe is primarily employability. Whether that becomes employment is another question. Employability, because we always blame lack of skills. This is the big lie, right? This is the big lie. We have a system, a capitalist system, which goes through crisis, which does not generate jobs, but we always put the blame on the individual lacking the skills or the community lacking the skills. Hence education is not the panacea. So we always put the blame on education, lack of skills. No, it's not lack of skills. It's the inability of the system to generate jobs because of its own contradictions, as Karl Marx once said. And of course, we talk about employability, but it's never employment. It's never employment. You know, we talk about lifelong learning, but then if you fall by the wayside because you don't have money to gain access to lifelong learning, or you don't have the knowledge which doesn't reach you in your village to take advantage of the program, and you fall by the wayside because even if you've gone through the program, there are other things in life. It's not just this. For you to land the job, it's your fault, not the system. It's always your fault. So blame it on education. And so they are dependent on this kind of money, but there are some clever people working at the village sector, at the community sectors in many countries, and they know how to get around the system to support financially their own projects. And I think hats off to these people, because that makes at least adult education work interesting. Is the interesting thing is not what comes out of the commission, but how that is circumvented. And I think my country has a lot to learn from this.
Okay, and maybe as a last remark, there's a question about your background in art history as well. So what do you think about the removal of statues and monuments that reflect histories of racism, colonialism, and oppression?
Okay, that's a very topical issue. I had the same question thrown at me last Monday. So I've reached a stage now, I'll be very disappointed if I don't get that question. Okay, roads must fall, as they used to call that in South Africa. I am fully sympathetic because, look, you cannot understand, I think, and doesn't mean that I do understand, racism unless you do your work and do it seriously. And there's a lot of work to be done. And you have to start from slavery, the history of slavery. You can learn it from novelists, in my view. Now, somebody else who is steeped in anti-racist education and who has suffered in terms of his ancestral history or her ancestral history, slavery, or has suffered also racism that we don't suffer. So we have suffered, we do suffer in different ways. I'm sure even people in Turkey suffer this when they go somewhere else. You know, but different levels. They would say, okay, you know, they are much better positioned than I am to talk about this. But my understanding from what my limited knowledge is that it's important to understand slavery. There was slavery every period, but there's a particular kind of slavery which is closely connected to capitalism. You cannot disassociate. You cannot dissociate actually the anti-racist struggle from the struggle against capitalism, just as you cannot dissociate it from the struggle of class and gender. This is what intersectionality is all about. And of course, the people who suffered for the things of beauty that we appreciate have been built on the backs of other people against great suffering. Now, big question is this. Now here is where it becomes a big issue, a can of worms, as we say. I have no answer to this because I don't understand. My understanding of racism, despite what I've read, despite what I've listened to, despite what I've tried to follow. I was just watching a play yesterday about it, a small island, group of Jamaicans who then emigrated to England. Oh my God, the kind of racism they used to get at the time still exists, of course. That's why you had the National Front. Still exists in England, but it was writ large then. I cannot speak the way an African speaks about suffering racism because I have not suffered that kind of racism. My knowledge is limited. I have partial knowledge. An African person has much more than my partial knowledge because he or she or they they experience it every day. So I defer to their knowledge, but it doesn't mean I don't take a position. Some people have asked me the question, you who like art, suppose you have a beautiful work of art and the guy is a slave trader. Okay. I would say following Edward Said, following Stuart Hall, following C.L.R. James, you learn from these people who are better positioned than you are, not because they are in academia, because they suffer racism themselves. They never dismiss a work of art simply for one thing. So this is one dimension which I critique, and it's racist. And a racist is a racist. Whatever the circulation of interpretations are, because, you know, what's the word? Meaning is also changes according to one's interpretation. You can play Shakespeare differently. A Jew can play Shylock differently, even without tampering with the words. You can do that. An African can play something else. But the point is, it's multifaceted. I don't see any multifacets in these statues which are being toppled. These are simply, they're not works of art. These are simply celebration of at some stage, of figures who contributed directly to slavery. And they are, what they represent was at some stage, the community identified with it. Now, the problem with these, and I'm quoting Boaventura de Sousa Santos on this, the problem with these is that what they represent still exists today. It culminates in the killing of Floyd. It culminates in the killing of Lasana Sise in Malta. So the issue that they were dealing with is not a thing of the past. So the statue can remain maybe and entertain the pigeons, you know, who fly over them. But this is still being felt today, and therefore they must fall. Because the issue is not settled, it is there today.
So I think Guy Hojam has something to say here. Guy, I saw you.
Guy,
Yes. Well, Peter, this has really been great to see you and hear you.
And Guy, you are in the heart of it in America.
Oh, yes, it's something. It is something. You know, when I see all these folks, some friends and new friends, and this idea, this organization that's happening is really tremendous. And Peter, you know, I go back with my study of your work, and one of the things that I looked at was Gramscian education, and one of the themes that runs throughout that book, Joe Buttigieg and
he passed away, you know that.
Yes, you know, one of the themes that goes throughout, and I quote from Gramsci in your book, radical transformation of social relations is a requirement for critical pedagogy. And I am brought back all the time to the notion that many people on this screen, including me, owe their entire careers, their lives, their livelihoods to working teachers who must attend these institutions for their credential life. And I always think about that in the teachers. And I think about organizing and old school organizing where you have a committee and you make motions to a group. You say, who is a critical pedagogue? Maybe it's worth considering that there's a evidence of critical solidarity is required for all of us, that we
You're talking about teacher preparation institution.
Yes, and that we show that we spend time in classrooms. How many hours do we spend walking into a school, requesting to talk to teachers, working with teachers in their scholarship as they come through university, in teachers' organizations, unions? I think that notion would play very well to be able to say, let me think back. Have I been shoulder to shoulder, not above, but shoulder to shoulder at any time with the working teacher? And I just think that would be a tremendous thing for this kind of group to recognize.
Yes,
And,
yes.
I just, well, your work has been a tremendous inspiration.
I was a school teacher for many years.
I know you were. I know that. I remember talking with you.
I went very late into masters. I did well.
Yeah.
I could have
Right.
taken a, I did, and what I did, I studied English part in the evening, and I was teaching in the schools. But of course, schools have changed. But when I lecture, I also give practical examples for what happened to me, and I'm never the paragon. This is a big mistake I did. This is where I got it wrong. This is what I didn't get in my teacher preparation. You get lectures, you think these were the paragons of excellence. Everything's brilliant, you know? It's not like that. I struggled as a teacher, even discipline-wise, etc. I admit this. And I've had bitter experience. I have lovely experiences too, you know? And I still get, because sometimes I get called up on my own occlusions, if you like. My peculiar eclipsing, as Dorothy Smith would say. But having said that, Gramsci, you mentioned Gramsci. Gramsci makes a very interesting point. He's got one of his notes in the Letteratura Vita Nazionale is about how people depict others in a very, and he's talking about, this applies to all kinds of migration. He was talking about specific migration, people from the south, from the islands, and Sicily, Sardinia, and people from, and the other islands around Sicily, the small ones, where he was also incarcerated at first, so Ustica, etc. And then, how do people analyze them? And the big problem for Gramsci was, and I think he's damn right about this, and I think teachers should take this. We look at migrants. This applies also now to migrants today. We look at them at the point of arrival in our countries. So what's the problem with, what's the situation with Somalis in Malta? No. First go and research Somalis in Somalia. What were the elements which made them migrate in the first place? Gramsci writes about this. He takes on novelists who are writing popular novels and not popular, and he was saying, this is a big problem. This guy doesn't know anything about the Calabrian. He was referring to Calabrians. He tells us nothing about Calabrian peasant life because he's lumping Calabrians together. But when you go to Calabria, it's like what a very good friend of mine, Handel, writes about Africans. Is there an African I see before me? You know, the famous dagger scene of Macbeth. Because they're different. I mean, the different indigenous, today we don't use the word tribes, indigenous groups. The different indigenous groups, you don't lump people together. The way the colonialists united factions within the same country, where Biafra and the rest of Nigeria. You know, there was a bloody war about this once, in 69, that time. So what made the migrants leave the country in the first place? And the power dynamics within that same. So you don't create stereotypes. They leave the country, then you one thing altogether. But they were different. Let's analyze that place. And he takes on a particular Italian. I don't know if she's listening. Ursula Appich wrote, she brought this to in mind, and then I went to look it up in the original. So Gramsci has a lot to teach us when it comes to inter-ethnicity. If you draw out the, you extrapolate from what he wrote about people who became part of that peninsula called Italy, which was quite new. Well, new at the time Gramsci wrote. It was only 1870, you know, and the kind of stereotypes that gets created. So I love, you know, everybody's got his own pet subject, and I love theater a lot. I've never been an actor, but I enjoy it. And Gramsci writes a lot about theater. But it's one of the reasons why I like Gramsci a lot, and also because of the Southern question, because I come from Malta. Okay, but
sorry.
That is so something we have to study migration before people migrate. What led them to migrate? Trace them back, and I think this is a key Gramsci idea which I take up. And he criticizes teacher institutions because they're not doing this work. And he says, you know, better keep people that are therefore away from these institutions, because teachers are just teaching the kind of parrots, which he probably had in his own school, the kind of totalizing discourse about the Calabrian, the Sardinian. Remember, he was Sardinian, was particularly sensitive to this.
One more thing, please. We can never forget that this ground that we're talking about is also, and you see it walking down the street in Turkey, walking down the street in Egypt, anywhere, the foundation of the slavery and the white supremacy of the Roman Empire can never be forgotten. And I think we can never forget that still infects us. Imperialism is what you're talking about.
It's always like that.
Imperialism, and also white supremacy, elite supremacy.
Exactly, exactly. But then, of course, what people are talking about in the Black Lives Matter movement is a particular kind of racism, which
Absolutely.
is
Yes.
the life we enjoy, which is capitalism. This is it. Yeah. But of course, it's.
Yeah, I would also like to mention Dr. Barbara Veltri's comments here. Maybe Barbara would like to share herself.
Who's that?
Yes, Peter, I saw you last year in, well, first of all, I saw you in Greece a couple of years back, and then last year in Naples.
Oh yeah, I remember you, yes.
Yes, you talk about higher education. I like to read your work, but our university right now, where Guy was fortunate to retire from, is becoming like Star Trek. They talk about the university as enterprise.
Yes.
Everybody has to be a prophet, not being a prophet, but making profit.
Yes,
I
yes.
also am concerned about your ideas regarding the social movements that are hijacked by some of these groups that look to see that they're working for a public good.
Mhm.
And currently we have, and I just found out today, and in fact, David Berliner just sent me a note. If you know David Berliner, he said, I have to write something today about this, because our governor is giving money now to, for the pandemic, to go back to school. And the first thing he's looking to do is make sure the children are tested. Meanwhile, they haven't had school. And then the second thing is he's giving money to a for-profit organization that nobody would really know about. So I guess my question to you is, even though we are in the academy and we're critical educators, how is it that we keep vigilant? Because we have to have the eyes on the ground to know what's happening now to be able to respond in a timely fashion. Otherwise, the funding and everything else that we need is used up. And, there's so much hidden. There's such hidden agendas. So
Yes.
Please speak to us about that. Thank you.
I cannot generalize because I don't know the context. Every context is different. But of course, vigilance is a very important thing. I think the big question, if one can generalize something, is you examine, as good old Socrates said once, as reported by Plato, your life has to be examined. An unexamined life is not worth living, in the sense that who's going to benefit? This is the classic critical education question, WH question, and the how question. Who benefits from this move? For what? And how? And I think this is extremely important. And sometimes we do rush blindly into situations. I've done it myself. And then you see that this gets exploited. It's not your intention, but that's what happens, how it gets exploited. This could be taken up. So Michael Apple, actually, I remember, once wrote in his revised version of one of his most famous books, I don't know if it's Ideology on the Curriculum or Education on Power. I quoted it recently. There are moments, where you have to be careful and you refuse a gift horse. It sounds, this is an opportunity, but I'll stay back, because if I go in, something else can happen. And sometimes you have to refuse it. So yeah, what we can do is look at the ramifications of this action. You may have an action which gets read so differently, as most things do. People read things differently. In this sense, it could have negative implications. Other than that, I cannot. It depends on, I have to understand, what's the context you're talking about? Which state is this? Remind me.
I'm in Arizona with Guy.
Arizona, that's really, yeah, where Daniel Shugurinsky is as well, Arizona State University. Yeah, yeah, I mean, you've had lots of things going on in Arizona, not just that, from what I read.
Oh yeah, we had SB 1070 where you could be looking like you were Latin and people could pull you over and, you know, put you in jail. So, I mean, there's a lot that, you know, we're dealing with because sometimes as educators, as Guy talked about, you know, when our work does not agree with the university's messaging, we are penalized. So, but the vigilance means that we have to be examples for the practitioners because where do they go?
Yeah. And they are, as any teacher is in a school system, they are in a much more difficult situation than we are because despite everything, despite the control, which has always been increasing, we've got this new managerialism, right, that you were talking about. You know, you have to provide outcomes. A course on Gramsci, I used to teach this. What do you write as an outcome? To produce full-time revolutionaries. Yeah, big deal. I mean, what the hell do you write? I joke about it. I just throw in a few things here and there, you know, it's a big joke. I actually once wrote it. They told me, don't be funny. That was the answer I got. You know, like it's all based on outcomes when most of our work is on process, not outcomes, you know? It is, but we are privileged in a particular way. I think we are, compared to the school teacher. I remember the school teacher, you know, where the syllabus is shoved down your throat. You know, you can't do anything, you can't move. At least I create my own syllabus at the university where I teach, because I can justify it as part of a course of a teacher preparation. And then if we teach master's level, graduate studies, so we are free in a certain way. And I think because of that, I experienced much greater freedom as a university professor than I was when I was a school teacher, where I was running adult education within the education division, bureaucracy and everything. And therefore, that comes with responsibility. You have the freedom and a bit of authority, especially in a small place like Malta. Not that they listen to you, but you know, you're there. I have a program like this was being followed. Therefore, if you don't do this, who's going to do it? Because other people don't have the freedom that you have, you know. Then there's always the risk that somebody will you know, like will throw red paint on your door, etc. But you know, I mean, come on, we enjoy that as long as we remain alive, so that we can transform. Because it's nice playing the victim, you know. But anyway, yeah, I mean, we are privileged at university, I think. Of course, less than before, but we are.
Thank you very much.
So we have to be role models. So the onus is on us. If we don't speak, who does? You know, I mean, I don't give a damn about the trolls who respond to my articles in the newspaper. You know, I mean, they call me all kinds of things. An obnoxious multiculturalist, one of them wrote. I said, sorry, anti-racist, who has been poisoning the mind of youth for years. Great. I'm Socrates, mind for years. Right. Anyway, unless they bump you off, whatever. It happened to a journalist in Malta, by the way. So, yeah.
Okay, Peter. This was so inspiring. We are having so many questions, but unfortunately, we have to stop here because of the recording issues, and you know, we're gonna upload this recording to our YouTube channel, and people can visit there and continue maybe discussing there, because
we can circulate. We can circulate.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your contributions, all participants. People are still here, about 40 people. I know they have comments and questions to you, but unfortunately we have to
I use email, so you can write to me, send me an email message.
Okay. You made it very interactive and very inspiring, and it was really very teaching for us too. I don't know how to thank to you. I'm really grateful.
No, I can thank you because I learned from all of it, everybody. So, you know, it's both ways.
Okay. We will keep in touch.
Let me know when you have a session with somebody, so I can also come in.
Hey, great. Okay. Thank you for this.
Thanks a lot,
Bye.
everybody.
Take care, and
thank you very much.
Greetings to Malta.
Yeah, and keep radical. Yeah.
Okay.
Radical on the left, of course.
Bye.
Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.
Okay, good.
Cheers. Bye.